Culture is something that you can write down values. I've been to lots of different companies and see in lobbies where you might have mission statements or values listed. That's all nice, but values are really what you live and what you act on.
You're listening to Lives that Speak, a podcast highlighting the remarkable work of Sidwell Friends School alumni. I'm Bryan Garman, the head of school at Sidwell Friends, a pre-K to 12th grade independent Quaker school located in Washington, D.C. In this interview, we sat down with David Fischer, an alumnus from the class of 1990. Currently the chief revenue officer at Facebook, David is responsible for the company's advertising business and manages the sales and marketing teams worldwide. Prior to joining Facebook in 2010, David was the vice president of global online sales and operations at Google and served as the deputy chief of staff of the U.S. Treasury Department and also as an associate editor at U.S. News and World Report, where he covered economics and business from Washington, D.C. In this episode, we discuss the importance of giving a voice to all and the delicate balancing act of nurturing an inclusive organizational culture. So welcome to David Fischer. David, thank you so much for taking time to be with us this afternoon out of your busy schedule.
Thanks, Brian. It's great to be with you.
The last time we were together, if you remember, I visited you in San Francisco, and it was really on the eve of the pandemic. And I don't think we had any sense that we would be in the position now.
Not at all. I remember sitting there looking out of our office windows over downtown San Francisco on a nice day. And I think we were making plans about doing a podcast like this, but I couldn't have imagined just everything that would have ensued over these months. So I hope everybody out there is doing as well as possible in what is a year that I hope we will never repeat.
Yeah, it's been a trying time for everyone, a trying time for our community, trying to balance the health of the kids and their education. And I know that's something that's always on your mind too, and you've been involved with your children's schools. How are they doing, and how have they fared in this virtual environment? Because I know things were closed down in San Francisco for quite some time, and schools are still opening.
Right now, they're still remote, and I think the headline is that we're fortunate to everyone be healthy, and at this time, we can't take that for granted. So, and we're fortunate that way. I think it's safe to say that we all look forward to being back to life a little more like normal. And I know my 14-year-old son, I think he can't wait. I can't wait for him to be able to go back to school because everything's still remote for him. But we are doing okay, and right now we'll take it.
Yeah, that's right. It's you've got to be grateful for what we have. Tell me, you came to Sidwell Friends in the 9th grade, isn't that right?
It was actually 11th grade, so I had only 2 years there.
Yeah, so very quick, but in some ways, the school made an important impact on you.
It sure did, and I have such fond memories of that time. I think starting just with the friendships that I made, and some of my closest lifelong friends were from those 2 years, my final 2 years of high school there. I think, the other things that really opened my eyes to, I think one was just moving to DC. I had grown up outside Boston until that point in my life, and just how involved Sidwell is in the world around it and community, and how uniquely special it is to be in DC. So I think part of it was just opening my eyes to the world, the broader world, all of the multicultural aspects. And certainly I remember things that I had never even thought of doing beforehand, going and protesting with classmates outside the South African embassy, for example, against apartheid and things like that. So I think just opening the world to the issues out there, and in a world in which, I certainly had a lot of privilege in my life, and I don't think I'd recognized it in particular before coming. I think that was something that was incredibly valuable.
Yeah, and I remember now that you mentioned coming in 11th grade, I think you were at Latin, right? While you were up at Roxbury Latin School, right?
That's right. That's the school I went to for 4 years in Boston.
So some distinctions between those schools, right? Roxbury, another very fine school. And certainly that was had an impact on your thinking and your experience. What else are the big influences that you would say you encountered as a young person?
Well, I think one that I'd pick up there is, that was a boys' school, but again, I was so fortunate to go to two outstanding schools between Sidwell Friends and Roxbury Latin. One of the things that I was there from seventh to 10th grade before my family moved to Washington, and I grew up in a nice suburb of Boston, relatively homogenous. And one of the things that Roxbury Latin really opened my eyes to in a way that took some time to see was they do an outstanding job there in terms of building a really diverse student body, both in terms of racially, socioeconomically, and but I think I was 12 years old when I started there. I didn't know what that was or didn't think about it. I just knew I had a bunch of classmates, and I came in not knowing any of them. And then over the course of studying, being in class, being on the playing fields, uh, you just start to realize, these are your friends, these are your classmates. And then at some point along the way, when you start going to people's houses or just comparing notes on life, you start to realize, oh, there's a lot more people are coming from a lot of different places. And so I actually think that grounding, and then of course coming to Sidwell Friends in Washington, DC, uh, and continuing that education, I think that and the values that come out of that, of just this sense of understanding we're coming from different places, and this sense of privilege, which we now talk so much about. Then I don't know that I had words for it, but I think it gave me some understanding of that, and that's really informed, I think, a lot of what I've gone on to do, and certainly the values that I hold and the way that I want to live my life and hopefully raise my kids.
When we were in San Francisco together, you were about to be the keynote at a diversity event that Facebook was holding.
I was, and I've been involved for my decade at the company. I've actually been the executive sponsor of the Black At Group, which is our employee resource group for Black employees, and which, if you see a photo of me, you will note that I'm not the obvious choice for that. But I think one of the things that I've carried forward from those early formative experiences that I talked about is an appreciation and understanding of how important uh, diversity is. And I think, important now, we talk so much about diversity and inclusion, but understanding what the experience is like for people other than myself, and even this journey, certainly these last couple of years, and a lot of terrible events, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd. Unfortunately, we could go on
Right.
too long on that, but I think what I am hopeful about, even in the midst of such a trying time, is just the increase in understanding. I know for me, this is part of a journey, and it's a lifelong journey, but the chance to grow myself and share those experiences. And I think as a society, as a country, certainly we as a company are working hard just to, frankly, give voice to those, help people understand it, because it's usually, frankly, people who look a lot more like me than necessarily, in this case, our Black employees, who really need to make the investment to understanding. But too often, frankly, we as a society can turn to the group that that we are challenging, that we may be oppressing, and asking them to help solve it. And so, I view that as something, part of my role is to try to play an important role, but also give voice to realities like what I just said.
So the social justice component is important to it, but Facebook also has an interest in it from a DEI perspective. I would guess in terms of the quality of thinking that emerges in the organization. So what's the business proposition in your uh, estimation around equity and inclusion in a corporation like Facebook?
Well, look, one of the things that is a great privilege, but one that we take seriously and need to, is we serve 3 billion people right now around the world, in terms of who use Facebook or other platforms, Instagram, WhatsApp, Messenger. And so, with a company of over 50,000 employees, that's a big company, but compared to the community of people that we serve, that's very small. And so, we need to understand the different needs, just where different people are coming from. And so that's one important basis. And a second one, related but different, is just in terms of the way we run the company and decision making. There's so much research on this. So hopefully it's well enough understood, though I fear it's not always. It's just that in terms of having the best thinking, the best decision making, I know for the team I work most closely with that that we usually make best decisions when there are ideas other than mine. Put a different way, I know that if it all came down to me making those decisions, I'd get it right sometimes, I'd get it wrong sometimes. But when we have the collective wisdom and opinions, and importantly, a debate process leading up to those decisions that bring in a lot of different backgrounds, experiences, and that includes any number of factors in terms of where people grew up, how they grew up, uh, economic status, racial background. We make better decisions, and those things play out in so many different ways. So I think that, like, the case, the rationale for this is so strong in so many different dimensions. The challenge often comes in executing and doing well and creating a diverse workforce, diverse communities, and then that inclusion piece of one where everybody can connect, but also people can come and feel feel at home in that environment
Hmm.
and be set up to do their best work. In the case of our company, that's something we focus on as well.
Hmm. Hmm. And how do you manage in what has become a really polarized political environment in this sense? How does that complicate these efforts?
This is a challenge that I think we're all living with right now. We're recording this 2.5 weeks before the U.S. election, and obviously this is an important factor in this country and around the world. And I think that struggle of wanting to talk about the types of issues that we've been talking about these last few minutes, Brian, but also what I just said, which is part of running an inclusive community, inclusive workplace, is making sure that everyone can come to work and be their best selves and do their best work. And I know one of the pieces of feedback we hear sometimes from our Black community, and again, just in my role as an executive sponsor of that group, I spend a disproportionate amount of time with them. But it's certainly, I think it's equally true for uh, our LGBTQ or Latinx community, or you name it, is that sometimes people want to come and debate a lot of the issues that are going on in our country or in the world right now. And that's important. We are, after all, a company that is folk and has as our mission to build communities and bring people closer together, and that includes discussing difficult issues. The challenge can be that sometimes that can make it really hard to come in and work. And if you come in and you log into our workplace, which is our internal version of Facebook, and you come and you have people saying things sometimes, or expressing political views that, let's be honest, a lot of people may hold, but that frankly may come across to a lot of people as gaslighting or just as attacks. It can be hard to then just say, okay, now I'm going to sit down for a few hours and do some important work. And so there's a real tension there, and we feel that at the company, we feel it as a society right now.
Right.
And I do think dialogue and just being honest and open about what's going on is an important part of figuring out how do we move forward effectively and together. And that's easier said than done right now.
What sort of ethical framework do you try to develop as a leader around these particular issues? One, and then how does Facebook, if you're able to talk about that, think about this from an ethical standpoint in the way, uh, right? You're balancing perhaps on one hand free speech, and then what does it mean to be a civil society? How do you think about that tension?
There's an inherent tension. Exactly. I'm glad you used that word, because I think it's so important. And it's certainly true in our work and our mission and our values. And I think that's true in almost anything that we do. We were having a discussion the other day just about our company culture in light of some of these issues, and how we want people to come and express themselves, but some of the ways that people want to express themselves are frankly counterproductive uh, to creating kind of inclusive culture. And so, as much of as what you do and what you reward, there's also what you don't reward or what you don't allow. So that comes into play. But let me step back because I think you're asking the bigger question about principles. And we start with our mission and standing for voice. You mentioned free speech. We ultimately are on the side and believe that giving people more voice, more chance to express themselves is important, is valuable, and is a force for good. But at the same time, we know, and we've seen far too often, that that alone isn't enough. And I think part of our journey as a company these last many years has been about how do we strike that right balance between we want to encourage speech, and there's times that means that things that I find objectionable, you might find objectionable. Certainly, a lot of my friends and family members I hear from find objectionable. Enabling that in the name of letting different people come and express and debate. But where do we draw the line? And we're seeing that right now in this current environment, certainly with this election. It's a hotly contested discussion and debate. And so I think that's, there is that tension. And I think being explicit about that tension is important. And so, we've said very clearly that in standing for giving people voice, that's going to mean that there's going to be some voice that some may find objectionable. I think what is important and something that continues to evolve is then being clear about where do you draw the lines on objectionable.
Uh, that's a really provocative response. Thank you for that. I'm interested in this line drawing though, right? Because we all have to do it, right? And this conversation is taking place on college campuses. It moves into education, as you made very clear. It moves into the workplace. What is the line? Like, how do you think about that as a leader, and how does Facebook think about that issue? That this is too objectionable, and here is the line.
Well, look, it's an evolving process, and that's part of what's really difficult about this. I think, we've drawn the line at content that might incite violence or might be hateful.
Right.
But part of what's challenging about that is there are vastly different definitions in the world of what that might look like. And just recently, we banned Holocaust denial on the
Right.
site, and that's something that, I mean, it's contentious and has been contentious internally and externally. I'm Jewish, and it pains me to see that content. Pains me to think that anyone either believes that or maybe doesn't believe it but wants to express those views. In that case, I think where if you think about that as a free speech issue of just saying, look, people should be able to express objectionable things, you can that's how you can come at that, and we did, and took a position to enable it. And then, but I think as you see more research and just realize, never mind in Germany or other parts of the world, here in the U.S., uh, new research and surveys that suggest that more and more young people in this country aren't aware of the Holocaust or aren't sure exactly what happened. You realize it goes from maybe an expression or a debate about views to a actual realization that people may not even understand this, or you may actually be playing a role in amplifying things that people are going to believe as facts, and that underlies part of this decision. But I think, as you can probably appreciate, if you're going to apply that in to billions of people around the world and billions of conflicts, millions of conflicts, however many there are, and disagreements or political debates, you name it, it's a hard standard to uphold. So that's, we come at it with a set of principles around harm, around violence, around speech, but unfortunately, it's one where there's always going to be some gray area, and we have an extraordinary team of people who does that work. But it also means that the hard decisions they make turn out to be really, really hard.
Yeah. And it's also a testament to the fact that there is more and needs to be more gray in the world, perhaps, than just black and white.
Look, I think that statement alone, just appreciating where other people are coming from, not so much on factual issues, but on opinions.
Yeah.
I certainly agree with that, and it is discouraging. During my time after college, I worked in DC for 6 years, and as a journalist, and then in government, and I love Washington, and I have a strong appreciation for our government. It used to really upset me when people would be so cynical and or just down on Washington or on our government. But I, having been away from Washington now for quite some time, I see and hear more of that, and it's certainly the feeling of polarization and division, and seeing things in black and white. It's am I for this or against this, and that leads to are we on the same team or different teams, and that's hard to see and disappointing to see. And I hope it's something that we as a society can do better at, and frankly, that we as a company and as a platform can be part of a solution towards.
Yeah, and you make an important distinction between something that is factually based, right, like the Holocaust, versus something that is, an opinion, right? That's an important, I think, distinction that Facebook has made. And it's not surprising, though, is it that right? This is an evolutionary uh, or a moving target, in effect, right? I mean, one of the things that about social media is the speed with which it moves, right? And you really must have, in the early days, kind of found yourself making it up as you go along.
Certainly, to some extent, there is an element of that. I mean, one of the things that really struck me when I left Washington in 2000 and had been working in the Treasury Department for 3 years before I left, and came out to Silicon Valley and started working a couple of years later at Google, was just how different the mindsets were of, I would say, leaders and sort of the the organisms as a whole. If you want to take DC and Silicon Valley as organisms, and what I saw and continue to see in Washington is just a risk aversion and a sense of mistakes were so costly because they would be used against you politically, whether or not they're big mistakes. And there's some issues, by the way, that in the world, and certainly that our government manages, that need to be managed very cautiously. But there are others where sometimes a small mistake, you can maybe used to bludgeon you politically in ways that I think are unfair and damaging. And coming out to Silicon Valley and just realizing there was much more tolerance for mistakes, and this philosophy that, look, if you made a mistake, can you learn from it, and can you do better next time? Realizing that there was much more openness to that. I think that's part of what has brought forth so much innovation. Now,
Mm.
I think an obvious then follow up or response that I can imagine people may have in their heads to that is, okay, but maybe can't that you have too much of a good thing? And I think we've certainly seen that, we as a company, and I think technology as an industry, as our scale has grown, as our impact in the world has grown, we've also had to adjust, and I think maybe adjust that dial of risk tolerance, particularly in some of the areas that we've talked about. And
Mhm.
I think that's appropriate. I think the challenge in all of this is it's a learning process, and you have to adjust. So yeah, I continue to think that I would love to see things maybe a little bit more risk tolerance in Washington in some ways, and we need to continue to make the adjustments we're making out on this side of the country as well.
So you see examples where the technology offends, but there's also places where the technology enables important change. Can you share an example where Facebook was used in a particular way that brought about some change that you're particularly proud of?
Oh, sure. I think that's one of the things that's so rewarding about being in this space and being at this company. Just earlier this morning, I was on the phone with an entrepreneur in Brooklyn named Stasha Harris, who is an immigrant from Trinidad and started up. She's in the hair care space, and she runs a couple of salons in Brooklyn, and particularly she's serves a black clientele and does hair weaving. And so she was just telling me the story of how she had to shut down her salons, when COVID hit, and she didn't really know what to do. She had a bunch of employees, and she basically figured out by going online, and she's done a lot on Instagram. She's been able to actually build a related but different business. and continue to employ people. And I get to hear stories like that throughout the world of entrepreneurs. There's a woman I met a couple of years ago in Indonesia who started a clothing company in her parents' not even in their house, in their hallway, basically, and now employs something like 80 people. And she started when I think she was 17. And, it's fundamentally changed her family, changed her community. I'm telling these stories because I work in the business side of things at
Right.
Facebook, but you could say the same things about people and finding voice and connecting. And, we see this in some social unrest. You always worry about one side of violence. On the other hand, in terms of giving people the power to speak up and raise issues that maybe in the face of oppressive governments or other difficult situations like that. So there's countless examples where you see the power of technology to enable people to connect, to give people more power, and that's incredibly rewarding. And I think that is part of when I talk about the power of innovation and risk taking to create new tools and put them in the hands of people. And in some ways, you have a thesis, you have a sense of where it's going to go, but then lots of unexpected things happen, be it the way that people are going to respond to the COVID crisis, and you suddenly realize what you might do in response. I mean, we as a company have pretty fundamentally altered our plans, the things we are building, the new tools and systems in the face of this pandemic. So 2020, as we come towards the end of it, looks so fundamentally different than everything we plan to do. But we've built so many tools for small businesses. We've created grant programs to help businesses and nonprofits. We've two $100 million grant programs to help people who are affected by this. And so that flexibility and agility that also I think is part of a hallmark of technology companies proves to be really valuable and frankly rewarding and fun if you're in a place where you can act on it.
Hmm. Let's go backwards a little bit. You mentioned your time at Treasury. What was your role there?
I had a variety of roles, but the final year and a half or so, I was the deputy chief of staff, which just was a fascinating experience to have at that point.
And what was enjoyable about that work?
This was the late '90s, and so it meant that a lot of the big issues that Treasury was dealing with at the time were a series of global financial crises in which we saw, fortunately at the time it wasn't in the U.S., but it looks, in some ways like things we've seen several times since then, but where we're seeing a lot of economies in parts of Asia, parts of Latin America, parts of the world go through really difficult times, and it meant that the role of Treasury, if we could help those countries help stand up a strong response that could stabilize their economies, that had a huge impact on people's lives. So just realizing the really important role that governments could play, both for people in your own country and around the world. And that was one learning. A second was just the quality of people in government. It's why it drives me crazy when you hear, uh, frankly, so many people bad mouthing government. Government, there's a lot of things it can do better. We talked about some of them earlier in this conversation, but the quality of people and working hard on behalf of the American people. So I had a fantastic experience. I'm a huge believer in our government and in government service, and it also, frankly, exposed me having the chance to interact with a number of businesses and entrepreneurs to a lot of what I didn't know. And I think that was what motivated me to want to come out to Silicon Valley, to the West Coast, and understand more. It was clear that there was this fundamental change happening in the country and the world being driven by technology and the disruption that was creating, and wanted to understand that. So I came out here. I don't know that I knew I would have been here 20 years by now, but it was certainly something that piqued my interest and made me want to take a leap and come on out here.
And so you moved to Google, right? When you first go to Silicon Valley, right?
Yeah, I actually came out and went to business school out here at Stanford for a couple of years because I knew that I was excited about it. Knew there were a bunch of things that I hadn't yet learned and wanted to have a chance to learn. And yeah, and then I ended up going to Google in 2002.
Yeah, those Sidwell folks who go to Stanford never come back, it seems, from the West Coast.
A friend when we moved out here said as a warning, they said, it's the Bermuda Triangle out there. People go and you never hear from them again. And
Yeah,
I think that's what he meant by it.
yeah, yeah. One of the things I'm interested in too is you move into that culture, and you used the word the culture earlier in the conversation when you were contrasting Washington D.C. with Silicon Valley. You have worked for two firms that have very distinctive cultures, and what have you learned from those cultures other than the need for risk taking, which you described earlier? What are the other takeaways that we should learn about from Silicon Valley?
Well, one important principle that infuses the culture at both companies is just the idea of that anyone can have a good idea, and frankly, the a big part of building the company successfully is hiring extraordinary people and then setting them up to be able to actually have ideas, to run with those ideas, and to be successful. And I've certainly seen plenty of cultures and corporate environments that are very hierarchical, where the expectation is there's a org chart and at the top is one person, and things kind of flow from there. And those can work in their way, but I think it's so much it's so much more powerful when you think about the role. I to the extent that I ever have to put org charts in slides or show them, which fortunately isn't that often, but I always like to stand them upside down and have the people with the biggest titles at the bottom, because I really think if you think about a service environment where you think about your job, I mean, I think about my job is to set up the people that we have around the world working with. We work with over 180 million businesses who are currently on Facebook or other platforms. And think about how do we serve them well, and that means setting up our teams, be they in Jakarta or in Warsaw, to be able to do that job successfully. And so I think we have a lot of flexibility and give people that risk taking nature that I mentioned means that you can tell people, okay, if you have a good idea, you can run with it. Now you got to put some constraints in place, but that is one that is really important. I think more broadly, I would also just mention about culture. Culture is something that you can write down values. I've been to lots of different companies and see in lobbies where you might have mission statements or values listed. That's all nice, but values are really what you live and what you act on. And so I think a culture really has to be something that's owned and maintained by employees. But it's the way that you behave, the way you treat one another, what sort of behavior you reward, and what sort of behavior you punish. And again, punish sounds like a really harsh word, but the point is, you're gonna if you say that you want to be a collaborative culture, but then you tolerate people who may be a really strong performer, but just a terrible colleague and really hard to work with, or worse still, or actually make it harder for other people to be successful, then you're not really living your culture. Then you have to call BS at some point on that. And I think understanding and thinking about what you're building and what trade-offs you're willing to make. In that case, it might be saying, hey, we have a great performer, but you know what, this isn't the right place for you because you can't work effectively, and we're trying to build a place that's really based on a collaborative environment. I'm a huge believer that having the right culture and building that and working at it, because it's not just building it, you have to maintain it. As an organization changes, as society around us changes, you have to work to actually maintain and keep it up.
There are a lot of Quaker principles in what you're describing.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think I didn't know when I came out to Sidwell when I think it was 15. I didn't know much at all uh, about any of this, and certainly I remember meeting for worship and sort of just sitting there and wonder the first few times. But I think that notion of giving everyone voice and listening and understanding and valuing people are also important. I'll tell you a related but slightly different anecdote that I think about sometimes when people ask me about the Sidwell experiences. I had a teacher for calculus, I think it was Richard Brady was his name, who happened to be Quaker, and I'd always enjoyed math, been pretty good at math, and I was used to, you come in, a teacher stands at front of, well, they were blackboards at the time, whiteboard, teaches you some concepts, you do some exercises, and you move on to the next thing. And I remember coming to this class, and it was completely turned upside down. He said, we're going to work on this area, and that meant sit and read the book and struggle with some problems and struggle with it some more, and eventually come up. And I remember going up and asking for his help, and sometimes he'd guide me, and sometimes he'd kind of give me a comment and send me back to learn more. But that that sense of empowerment and respect, but also, you have to take ownership and control, and learn for yourself. And I frankly found it a little mystifying and at times frustrating, but I look back at that with a lot of appreciation and thinking about, how you want to set people up to learn and to behave and to act.
Mm-hmm. Richard has just completed a book manuscript, and I think he's got a contract actually. So we'll have to make sure you get a copy of
Oh,
that.
great.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, he was a very deep thinker. Very deep thinker. You mentioned that 15-year-old that showed up at Sidwell Friends. What would you tell that 15-year-old now if you could give him some advice looking back?
um, oh man, that's a long list of things. I mean, I'm a huge believer. I say I've been fortunate in life in so many ways, and so I don't know that I'd ever go back and change things, but there's so many things I've learned along the way, and I think that the mistakes, the learning, is part of the journey. I actually was fortunate enough to give a commencement address at Sidwell back in 2014, and I actually built it around trying to think about what were just a few of the lessons that I would share with myself back when I was sitting in Zartman Garden in 1990. And so the three things that I pointed to then, well, actually, we sort of touched on all three of them already. But the first was about finding your voice and speaking your truth. Part of that came from a place where, as a kid, I think I was pretty easily intimidated and maybe a little bit shy. And I remember going out in the world, be it in college and in large lectures, or when I was in a work environment where I had ideas or thoughts, but maybe I was a little intimidated and didn't want to speak up or assumed someone else knew better. And you realize there's a lot of good people out there trying a lot of things, and maybe sometimes you'll say something and it wasn't the best thing to say, but more often than not, speaking up and acting, you have a strong voice. You have things that are worth hearing and saying. And so, the first thing was just don't be afraid of speaking up, and particularly speaking your truth when you see things go in a certain direction and there seems to be conventional wisdom, or in some cases just bad behavior. Try to find your voice and speak up. The second was about failure, and we've talked a lot about that, but not fearing it, and making sure that you're taking enough risk and understanding that a successful life is going to entail making some mistakes, and figuring out to learn how to learn from those, but not let them freeze you. And the third one, which is really the way that I think about it, the way I make a lot of decisions in life, is around always be learning, to seek opportunities where you have a chance to learn. The decisions I've made about what to do professionally all really have to do with being in environments where you can be learning. Now, you want to be contributing as well. Obviously, that's an important part of it. But I find it incredibly motivating, and feel like I'm at my best when I'm, bringing something to the table, but also facing some new challenges, and know that I have to grow to perform. And I think that's just true in a job. It's and true in life. And if it's not, that's probably a time to make a change. And I think embracing that feeling, and knowing that if you're not feeling like you're learning, maybe it is time to think about something else.
Mm.
So those are three things that I would certainly look back and share with my younger self.
So let's think a little bit about parenting, which is a really tough job, and it hasn't become any easier over the last
No,
months
sure
with COVID,
hasn't.
right? I mean, being a parent now is harder, I think, than ever. And part of what makes parenting difficult in these times is also technology, right? And parents are constantly looking for advice on how much should my child be online, how much should my child be using social media, how much should I be monitoring my child. How do you think about that? What advice would you give our parents?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's tough to be a parent. I mean, I say this as I can hear my 1-year-old daughter squealing out there, a few next room over. Um, and it's tough to be a kid. I mean, that's the other part of it. So I think it's tough all around and on a bunch of fronts. And technology is part of that. I mean, I think on some level, the big issues are the same, and in some ways it's different. And some of that has to do with the speed and uh, scale at which things can happen uh, with technology. I mean, let's face it. I loved my time at Sidwell, but there's certainly plenty of examples of things that I wouldn't wish that I saw, and in some cases was a part of that. I don't take any pride in. I'm embarrassed about, or that I would tell my children ways that I wouldn't want them to behave. And so I think that activity and bullying's been around forever. But the rate at which things can spread is really challenging. So I think, look, it starts with a couple of things. It starts with values, uh, and as parents, that's always been important. It starts with communication uh, as much as possible. And one of the things for me that as a parent that I've worked at and struggled with, and hopefully made some progress with, is trying to meet my kids where they are. It's always easy if it's a frame of mind or interests that are the same as what I like or what I liked when I was a kid. But the reality is sometimes that'll happen, and sometimes I find my kids are just interested in really different things than what I was interested in. And so trying to understand and meet them where they are and have an appreciation. And then look, I think when it comes down maybe to the more tactical level of what do you let your kids do or not do is I think in all things you want some limits, especially for kids. And so um, you know I what I try to approach is, one, understand what's going on. I think it's a parent's job to do that, and that includes what activities your kids are getting up to and what they're doing online, and then try to be a place and a source of support and strength. Sometimes judgment, but sometimes not judgment, because I think as much as anything, it's also things are happening quickly, and I can't keep up with all of it. But if you know that you can be a place where a part of solution, that's really important. So I think, look, I think every household should have a set of rules and policies, and that should include. I know some people whose kids don't spend any time on technology or screens, and some people whose kids spend a good amount of time. And I'm not here to say one is right or wrong, but I think having a structure around it, and then some outlets and ways to govern, and then to make sure when problems arise, because problems are going to arise in any of those scenarios, that you have a way to tackle it and to be there and to be supportive. Those are the things that I would encourage people to think about.
Yeah. Kids may tell us they don't want limits, but they do. They need them.
Those are some of the hardest conversations as parents, and I agree with you.
Yeah, I know I needed a few myself, so I'm grateful for those. Uh, this has been such a difficult time that has elapsed since you and I last saw each other. What are the lessons you take away from the COVID era to date?
Well, I think some of what I try to look to are some of the inspiring pieces, and a lot of the areas that we thought might be the worst hit have also been some of the source of the greatest innovation. There's, again, depending what you're looking at, but certainly in technology and in the use of technology by, I'll pick businesses again, because that's where I spend most of my professional time. I would guess that we've accelerated 5 years in a matter of months. Now, a bunch of that was out of necessity, but if you look at a lot of local businesses, I just think about the restaurants or dry cleaners or other businesses just here in my neighborhood in Palo Alto that I frequent. You know, we could have had discussions. I've had discussions in my role at Facebook or just talking to friends over, I don't know, the last 5, 10 years about, do you need a digital strategy? What should your digital strategy be? Sometimes those were nice to have conversations. Those are vital conversations now. And, unfortunately, some businesses we've seen not make it sometimes. And oftentimes that was just because of what's happened and there wasn't much anyone could do. But in other cases, we've seen people rise to the occasion. I mentioned the example of Stasha Harris, the
Mhm.
hairdresser in Brooklyn earlier. And people try things. And I do think that one's ability to pivot is such an overused word, but I do think it's right, is to change direction and try something new. That when you have to do it, you find you can do it. When you don't have to do it, it's easy to make a lot of excuses for one not to do. So I do think that's a takeaway of jumping into things a little bit more aggressively, um, going forward. I think the other thing that I would really point to is just how important connections are in ways that maybe we take for granted. If you think about how much time we at this point, I'm so tired of looking at myself on whatever video platform, be it Zoom or whatever you might use.
Right.
That background of me standing here at my desk for 7 months now. I get tired of it, but let's not forget just how much energy we get, and certainly I get, from connecting with friends, and particularly in the early months of this, when we in our household were in full lockdown. I mean, we weren't going anywhere, we weren't taking anyone in, so it was just us. But that ability to actually catch up with friends from throughout my lifetime and family members, and it is amazing. As much as as I hate this and can't wait for it to be over, members in my class, from my Sidwell class, led by a number of people, and my friend Gretchen Kolsky has really been pushing that, have been doing virtual meeting for worships on some weekends. And in fact, it's actually picking up pace and happening more often now than it did a few months ago. And I think remembering that and how important connections are, and making sure that we build time for that. Because I think one thing that probably none of us want, as much as we want to go back to life and the things we love, and in my case that means travel and getting to go places and connect with people who I've been missing. We each have our own version of that, but I hope we won't leave behind some of those really important lessons about making sure we're prioritizing the things that matter, about the people and the connections, and the values that are going to make a difference, in sort of when we look back on our lives.
Mhm. So there's certainly been a lot of parent anxiety that has emerged out of COVID, particularly in relation to education, which is completely understandable. How do you think about that, and how do you think about what some folks see as lost opportunities in this moment?
To me, this is one of the hardest issues that we've faced, and that people have faced, and I think particularly that younger people have faced. And I am at once both proud and worried for this environment. I had parent-teacher meetings for my 14-year-old son, who's in ninth grade, yesterday, and got to connect with his teachers. And I know that not being in school face to face is hard for him in a bunch of ways he's expressed. I can see it's hard for him in ways that, frankly, I'm not sure that he has expressed, but I can see it in some of its anxiety, some of its just distance and failure to connect. But I also see, I was really proud to hear a lot of the feedback from the teachers. And so I really think about just trying to hold both those things, of recognize there's so much about this that that we wouldn't wish for and that we hope will end. But there's still opportunities to make the best of it, and if not to thrive, to at least succeed. And I think for me, and even in the way that I'm parenting, I'm trying to see both of those things, and make sure that I recognize and speak to them, and in this case, reward and praise the good when you see it, even as I try to be really empathetic to the challenges.
You used wonderful phrase earlier when you were talking about being in the mountains. You find the optimism to move forward. We're in a difficult period in our history in so many ways. Certainly, you and I are close in age, and I don't think we've ever seen the kind of global challenges in so many areas uh, that are so clearly pronounced in any moment such as this. Where do you find the optimism to move forward now?
You know, I think I see it right now, even in the way so many people are responding to this crisis. So many of just the amazing ways, starting with frontline workers and the way that people have rallied. Look, I agree with your framing of the question, Brian. I don't know that I ever would have believed, putting aside COVID, just as a society, as a nation, as a world, that we would be as polarized and in as bad a place as I think we are. But at the same time, my experiences have uh, shown me time and again that there are outstanding people who want to do good and do the right thing. I don't claim to have a blueprint or an answer. How do we shake society out to bring together people who, too much of the time, seem more interested in making sure the other side loses than trying to help everyone win? But I also have an optimism that we will get there. And the way I try to think about it is, what steps can I take? What things can I facilitate that will at least take us steps in a positive direction? Because this year has also taught us, don't be fooled into thinking you can see the future, or that what lies ahead, even if it seems clear to you. And so I'm hopeful that just as we can have a year that where so many things go so much worse than we might have dreamed, that we will have times ahead where the opposite will be true. And at the end of the day, it's all about people. And I think there's so many just amazing people who come at life, wanting to help one another and make a positive impact in the world. And maybe that's a nice way to circle back, because I think that's what I said was one of the things that struck me most about my time at Sidwell was just sort of seeing that and the impact that people can have, and a focus on the world around you. And so that's where I come away from this with a sense of I'm certainly have plenty of trepidation, but I continue to be optimistic. I don't know what the path is, but I know, want to take steps towards what I think is the right direction, and hope that as a society we'll get there, and I hope we'll get there soon.
Yeah. David, thanks for your optimism and your wisdom and your thoughtfulness, and for being with us today. This was a lot of fun. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Brian, so much for having me, and I enjoyed it, and I just want to send my best to everybody out there in the Sidwell community, and hope everybody is doing as well as possible right now.
Thanks, David. Same to you.